This meeting is being recorded.
And Dr. Doerr, you're on mute right now. Oh, no. Oh, shoot. It's actually the unmute button way down there at the bottom of your screen, right next to stop video. I am laughing because I knew that it was a bad idea to have this during an eclipse. It's that uneven. Um, okay. So I think Dr. Doerr, why don't you go ahead and stop sharing your screen again?
Can you hear me now?
I hear you now, yes. Okay, can we go back to from the beginning? And we're good. It's all you.
We're good?
Let's go. Yes, take it away.
Okay, great. So my presentation's on recent medications that have come out for Alzheimer's disease. I'm going into geriatrics, so I had a particular interest in this. I have no relevant financial disclosures or conflicts of interest, so we can get started now. My objectives for this talk are, one, to review the history of what medications we have available currently for Alzheimer's, discuss the recent novel medications that have come to market and understand the studies behind these drugs. I also want to highlight the difficulties that are arising from these medications in coming to daily practice, and then just a brief look at the future developments in medical management for Alzheimer's disease as well. And so just to start out with, I'm sure we've all experienced taking care of patients with Alzheimer's dementia, but this is kind of a generalized pathway of what we see. Usually we start seeing these patients when they have mild cognitive impairment, as evidenced by various mental status exams you can do in clinic, and then they will slowly or sometimes quickly progress through these different stages from forgetfulness, loss in interest in hobbies, all the way to total dependence for cares of their activities, daily limiting or daily lives, and then the severe forms with agitation, different sleep patterns, and total dependence. And so just some statistics about Alzheimer's disease here. From what I could find, about 1 in 9 Americans have greater than the age of 65 have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. And with our aging population, this is only projected to grow. And numbers I could find were up to 13.8 million by 2060. In the midst of COVID, there was 121,000 deaths that were attributed to Alzheimer's. And at that time, it was the 7th leading cause of death. I think I was looking at more recent data, and it is likely jumped into the top 5 causes of death. And then just between 2000 and 2019, the data showed an increase of about 145% in deaths attributed to Alzheimer's. And this is just a little chart here to break down the demographics. The majority of people with a diagnosis are going to be between 75 and 84, but there's an extensive amount of patients 85 plus with a diagnosis as well, and just slightly less between 65 and 74. And so with this many people and the extent of the disability that comes with the disease, it is a huge financial burden on our healthcare system. That should read billion, but in 2020, care for Alzheimer's disease was approximately 300 billion, and you can see how it breaks down there with 155 billion coming from Medicare and other sources there. With the expected growth in the population, particularly the elderly, costs of taking care of Alzheimer's can be predicted to jump to around $1 trillion if everything follows the same path. And then I was looking up data for Medicare in total. 2020 spending for Medicare was approximately 830 billion. And so you can see Alzheimer's care takes up a huge chunk of that. And so besides financial burden, this is also a huge burden to caregivers, be it professional or family members. In 2022, and this is nationwide, 11 million family members provided 18 billion hours of care for Alzheimer's dementia. The cost of this being approximately $340 billion. And caregivers of people with Alzheimer's certainly have higher rates of stress, depression, cardiovascular disease, and healthcare utilization themselves. Found this particular graphic here interesting, as most of my colleagues are millennials and their parents are starting to age, but millennials make up a non-insignificant amount of caregivers, approximately 15% from this data source. And unfortunately, a fair chunk of these have had to quit work entirely, 14%, and 33% have had to take periodic time off work. As you can see, 79% of people are experiencing distress. And so it's obviously a huge burden to the patient, but also a huge burden to our caregivers. Given that we're in Idaho, I looked for more specific data to Idaho and was able to find some. And so right now there's approximately 30,000 patients older than the age of 65 with a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, representing about 10% of that population. We have about 66,000 caregivers, and then you can see there's huge numbers of hours of unpaid care going on, which is an astronomical amount of money there. And this one surprised me the most. As of 2021, there was 8 geriatricians in the state of Idaho providing care. Obviously, much of the burden for this falling on the family physicians due to that lack of geriatric specialty. And 987.5% need increase by 2050 there is quite surprising. But it also is very prevalent in our nursing homes and hospice care as well, as you can see with those bottom numbers there. And significant costs. Medicaid's paying out over $150 million for Alzheimer's care, and the per capita Medicare spending is around $25,000 for each patient. And so, given the significant financial, emotional, caregiving burden, there has been significant work put into developing medications for the treatment of Alzheimer's. Unfortunately, it has not been very fast or very proliferative. As you can see, before 2021, there was only 4 FDA-approved medications for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. And all of these medications are symptomatic treatment, not aimed at eradicating the root cause of the disease. And so you've probably used these in your clinics before, but they are cholinesterase inhibitors or NDMA antagonists that aim to prevent neurotoxicity in the brain, which is one of the leading theories of the development of Alzheimer's. These medications aren't perfect either, and they have a significant side effect profile, as you can see here. And so with this in mind, we definitely need to put more effort into developing more effective medications. And so we started going down that route and had a new medication that received FDA approval in 2021, aducanumab. But you can see a significant gap there from 23 to 21 without any FDA-approved drugs. And aducanumab is a particularly interesting story, and so I thought I would delve into it a little bit. And so prior to doing so, it's important to see where our clinical trials are being pushed. And with Alzheimer's, we don't have a definitive hypothesis of why the disease is caused. And so you can see most of the clinical trials seem to be going into the amyloid hypothesis or the neurotransmitter hypothesis. And so before getting into aducanumab, I thought I would just briefly have us look at the amyloid hypothesis here, which the drug targets. And so I'm sure all of you have learned this before, but essentially we start with these precursor proteins that through a host of different factors here start developing into these beta amyloid strands. And these strands start out as monomers, but through processes unknown can become polymers, and then they aggregate and form plaques. And then the theory is that these plaques will lead to vascular neuronal dysfunction, lead to neuronal death, and cause cognitive impairment. And then this system is also influenced by aging, by genes, environmental factors, and genetic risks. And so back in 2007, Biogen started looking into anti-amyloid antibodies. And over the years, they developed their trials. They went through animal models, and then eventually were able to start testing on humans. And around 2015, they started doing their phase 3 trials, Engage and Emerge being the primary trials here. And so I'll dive into it a little bit, but eventually in 21, it ended up getting accelerated approval from the FDA. And so this, just to start out with, this drug is no longer on market, and I kind of wanted to dig into why that's the case. And so there was quite a bit of controversy, if anyone remembers, back in 2021 about this. But the initial treatment was set for $56,000 per year, and so obviously not feasible for most people at that point. There was a advisory committee that the FDA had on board who expressed their concerns about the lack of evidence, the safety issues, and concerns with the data analysis itself, and had advised that this medication not get approved. There was also numerous adverse effects, including ARIA-E and ARIA-H, which I'll discuss later in this talk, among the numerous side effects. But the FDA still pushed this through in 2021, on the accelerated approval pathway. In the same year, the European Medicines Agency rejected this drug. And as of January 2024, Biogen had announced that they had stopped commercial development of this drug and desired to focus on other products, which we'll get to later as well. So I didn't want to dive too deep into the studies for this because I wanted to focus on the next drug, but here are the kind of two big trials that underwent for aducanumab, the Engage and the Emerge. But essentially, if you can see on this data, you were getting discordant results. The Engage trial didn't show any significant difference between treatment group and placebo based on these cognitive status test on the side here. And so initially, studies were stopped due to futility, but they did some reassessment of the data in the Emerge trial and did find some statistically significant slowing of cognitive decline. But there was massive debate about this, and then it even led to 3 of the FDA advisors resigning over the approval of this drug, just due to it getting pushed through with all these significant concerns. And so that drug eventually petered out. They couldn't get enough people to sign up for the infusions, and the company moved on to develop its next drug. And that's kind of the focus of what I wanted to talk about in our novel drugs here. The new medication that they started developing was Leqembi. And so timeline for this drug started in approximately July of 2022, where the FDA accepted application for accelerated approval. And then by January 23, it had granted the accelerated approval. And then by July of 2023, it had converted to the traditional approval. So it's available on the market right now. And the proposed mechanism of action for lecanemab is that it binds to the oligomers or protofibrils and prevents them from stacking and forming plaques. Previous studies looking into this have shown that these are likely the most toxic to the neurons. So that's why they wanted to develop the antibody against them. And so the big trial that looked into lecanemab was Clarity AD. It was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in November of 2022, so fairly recent. But this was an 18-month phase 3 clinical trial. It was double-blinded, placebo-controlled, in a parallel group trial. Fairly large number of participants, nearly 1,800, with an even split between those receiving lecanemab and those in the control group. And so eligibility criteria for for this study was ages 50 to 90. They needed to have evidence of only mild cognitive impairment or mild dementia, and that was based on the National Institute of Aging Alzheimer's Association criteria. Another important component was they needed to show amyloid positivity, and prior to the study, this was determined by either getting an amyloid PET scan or CSF measurements of the protein. They also had to have objective impairment in their episodic memory, and so this was determined to be 1 standard deviation below this Wechsler memory scale for logical memory. I didn't include it in this PowerPoint, but the exclusion criteria was quite extensive too, including people who are unable to get MRIs due to other hardware in their body, people with antiplatelet or anticoagulation, people with thyroid disease, people with vitamin B12 deficiency. They had a clause too where the PIs could say any medical condition they were concerned needed further workup at this time was also a cause to not be in the study. Then they included alcohol or drug abuse within the past 2 years, or other depression, or other diseases that could cause memory impairment. So they had pretty strict inclusion criteria for this study. And I just wanted to take a look at the study demographics in this slide, as it was, I thought, very important to the outcomes of the study. Might be a little small on your guys' screen, so I'll just take a run through these. But the average age for these studies people was 71, and that was equal between the two groups. It's a pretty good distribution between male and female. My concern comes when we look at race here, and it was predominantly white, with 76 to 77% of the study population being white, only 2.3 to 2.7% Black, Asian 17%, and then Hispanic groups were 12%. And I'll get to why this was concerning a little farther on, but you can see here too, they also looked at carrier of ApoE4 status here, as that has been linked to worsening Alzheimer's disease. And they did baselines of all these cognitive statuses that they'll look in their outcomes. So the primary outcomes they were looking for were changes in their clinical dementia rating sum of boxes score from baseline to 18 months, which was the study duration. The secondary endpoints that they were looking for were amyloid burden on the PET scans at 18 months. And then we have a few other cognitive screens that they looked at as well. This ADAS COG14 was a measure of cognitive impairment as well. The ADCOM score is used to look for cognitive change in early Alzheimer's dementia. This ADCS MCI ADL functions to look at the patient's ability to perform their ADLs. And then they also looked at various CSF biomarkers for Alzheimer's. And so I had never clinically used the CDR-SB myself, and so here is the criteria that are used, and you can see they assign a different point system for each domain. The domains include memory, orientation, judgment and problem solving, community affairs, homes and hobbies, and personal care, with scale running from 0, meaning they have no deficits, to 3, meaning they have severe deficits in that domain. So lowest score you can get is 0, and the maximum score you can get is 18. You can see these changes. I won't go through all of them, but just to highlight some. In terms of memory, a 0.5 change could go from no memory loss to slight. And then orientation, you could go fully oriented to fully oriented, except for time relationships, which is me most of the time. But this was the primary scale they used. And if you remember from the demographics, most of the patients had a initial score of approximately 3. And so if we look at the primary outcome. Pardon me?
I think that was just some background noise, and I've muted that participant. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. All right, so here is the graph from the primary outcome. And at first glance, it looks fantastic. We have the control group and the study group here looking at the decline from baseline on their CDR-SB. And you can see almost immediately after the 3-month mark, we start getting a divergence here. Important to know, though, that both groups continue to show cognitive decline, but we see a slowing of cognitive decline of about 27% when you compare lecanemab to the placebo group. And so 27% decline, that equates to about a negative 0.45 difference on the CDR-SB. So if we go back here, you'll notice that's almost about a one-step increase from either none to questionable or questionable to mild here. And so first glance, like I said, this looks pretty great. The company took that 27% slowing of the progression and ran with it. And then we'll look at the secondary outcomes as well before we go more into what happened after these studies. But you can also see quite significantly the lecanemab group had a significant decrease in the amyloid burden, with almost next to non-existent amyloid burden at the end of the study. The placebo group had no real significant change there as well. And then the other cognitive studies show a similar picture to our primary outcomes with clinically, or not clinically, statistically significant difference between the control groups and the intervention group. And so for those who are more inclined to numbers, this is just the same data from the study here as well. And so besides the data here, there was a significant amount of adverse events that it'd be remiss to not talk about when discussing this study. And so about 88.9% of people in the experimental group had an adverse event, 80% in the placebo group. Serious adverse events skewed slightly towards the intervention group rather than the placebo. But when we see the very significant differences down here on the bottom with the infusion-related reactions and the amyloid-related imaging abnormalities. And so for the infusion-related reactions, most of these were in the first infusion for the patients, and most of these were mild. There were only very few patients that had to stop the group, approximately 1% due to the severity of their reactions, but 1% is nothing to scoff at. But most of these people were able to manage these with over-the-counter medications. Some had a steroid prophylactic treatment as well. Interestingly, with the infusion reactions, the study commented that there was some concern that this may have unblinded the study to some of the patients and the researchers as well. And then the other one where I'll have another slide and talk more in depth on is these ARIAs that you see here. And this happened in 12.6% of the intervention group. And so this breaks down the adverse events into more granular detail here. And so what I wanted to focus on was the ARIA here. And you see that 113 patients in the lecanemab group suffered ARIA. And something I was looking at and what many people have discussed, both in the news and other studies, is the genetic prevalence here of the ApoE, either heterozygote or homozygote. And if you look at it, the homozygote carriers had a significantly larger adverse event count with the ARIAs as well. And so what are ARIA? And so ARIA can be broken down into ARIA-E and ARIA-H. And this stands for amyloid-related imaging abnormalities. And the E stands for cerebral edema, and the H stands for cerebral hemorrhages and microhemorrhages. And like I said, this happened in about 12.6% of patients in the experimental group. And I'm not a radiologist, but I thought I would point out the differences you see on MRI between these two. And so on the right, you see the edema group, and then on the left, I should say, and on the right, you see the ARIA-H, or the hemorrhage or microhemorrhages. And again, for most of these patients, this was an incidental imaging finding, but some people did have significant side effects. And these included confusion, altered mental status, gait abnormalities, with the worst being seizures. Looking at the post introduction to the country data, it looks like there's been 1 or 2 deaths that may be attributable to ARIA as well. I didn't really dive deep into that for this presentation, though. And like I mentioned before, it's more common in ApoE for heterozygotes and homozygotes. And so this is a major side effect and continues to be a black box warning for the medication today with lecanemab. And so I was interested in what they did with these imaging findings, and this was what the drug manufacturer had been doing during their studies for the management of the ARIA. But essentially, part of the study includes getting multiple MRIs, so most of these were just found on incidental findings. And when they detected them, they determined if they were severe, mild, moderate, and that kind of determined the next step. If they were asymptomatic and the disease burden was mild, then the patients continued on with their treatments and received monthly MRIs. And if the disease was more severe, then they could stop the treatment, they could follow it carefully, and resume when the area E or area H resolved. And most of these did resolve spontaneously, but there was, I believe, 1 patient who had to stop the study because of a macrohemorrhage in the experimental group. And then this wasn't a part of their study, but obviously after these studies showing a statistically significant change in cognitive decline, a bunch of other people started looking into it, especially with our history of aducanumab and the fiasco with that process of getting approved. But one study I found particularly interesting, and I was kind of directed to this by our neurologist after I was talking to them about the treatment, was that there's been studies showing accelerated brain volume loss with these anti-beta amyloid drugs. And so this one particular study I found looked at studies for various drugs. And as you can see, both with whole brain atrophy and ventricle enlargement, it favored more towards atrophy and enlargement with the drug. Now, we're not quite sure at this point what that means going forth in the long term, or whether this can be explained just by loss of plaque burden. This study in particular, though, commented that they think that the weight loss noted and volume noted would extend past just simple loss of the amyloid protein. And so taking all that data into account, one has to question, is this a miracle drug? And probably not. And I would be hesitant to call it that, especially with everything we just talked about. But the media fanfare behind both lecanemab and aducanumab have been significant, in studies or news stories singing its praises. But the important and first thing to remember when talking to patients about this is both the control and lecanemab did show continued cognitive decline. So while effectively eliminating the plaque burden, it didn't stop the progression of the disease going forward. And another big question that came out from the study, and you can read numerous opinion pieces on, is that we did see a statistically significant difference in the decline on the CDR-SB. But the real question is this clinically significant? And so I've heard arguments on both sides. One argument could be that 0.5 difference could be the difference between being a step higher or lower on that CDR-SB that we talked about. But another paper that I read into looked into what should we constitute as a clinically significant change in the CDR-SB. And from that paper, they suggested about a 0.98 to 1.63 difference over 18 months. And the average for our trial that we looked at, Clarity AD, was 0.45, so well below that. So I think the argument will continue on whether at 18 months this is a clinically significant impact to patients. And another thing is with this elderly, usually sick population, it did have some fairly significant adverse effects, with up to 7% of patients having to leave the study due to a significant adverse effect. The biggest one and the one getting the most news is the ARIA-E or ARIA-H. And in the study, most of these kind of self-resolve during the period of study, but there's not really great data on what the long-term consequences of these events are, whether they'll continue past the 18 months, and what if they will reoccur with continued use. And other just kind of general things is adverse effects tend to be worse when the drugs go to market. And when I was highlighting the inclusion and exclusion criteria, it's pretty strict, and it probably will not match most of our general population. And so how this drug interacts with one more widespread use will depend on further data collection here as well. And with the demographics of the study, again, this is white males, but it was pretty evenly white males and females as the predominant group that was studied, which is unfortunate here because we know rates of Alzheimer's vary by race and ethnicity. So it would have been better if we could get a more diverse population to study for this medication. Then we start getting into the practicality of this medication as it goes to market. And as of July, this medication was being covered by CMS. But the starting cost purely for the medication per patient is $21,000 per year. And due to the typical 80% Medicare pay, patients just for the medication would be out of pocket about $5,000. Other hitches to the implementation of this is you need a PET scan or an LP prior to initiating the drug to confirm amyloid. And then you need infusions every other week for these 18 months. You need an MRI at the start. You need a repeat MRI prior to your 5th, 7th, and 14th infusion. Again, that's looking for those ARIA events. And again, at 1 year of treatment, you'll need an MRI as well, which can be time and cost prohibitive to these patients. And so I wanted to look more into what the impact of cost would be, both on the individual and both for our healthcare system. And so this study I found looked specifically into the impact that the widespread use of lecanemab could have on Medicare spending. So this first slide here looks into how they came up with the numbers for their study, looking at a conservative estimate of how many people would pursue this treatment and an upper bound estimate of how many people in the country would pursue this treatment at this time. And so at the lower end, they estimated about 85,000 people could go through with this. And at the upper end, with more diligent screening, they imagined up to 215,000 people could go through with this treatment. And I really like this slide here. It kind of breaks down all the different parts of treatment and the cost impact. So if you look here, you can notice this very significant burden on the number of treatments, 24 infusions per year. And then they also have to pay not only for the medication, but for having the chair at the infusion service. PET scans are pretty costly too, if available. You have to have occasional visits to your geriatrician or your neurologist. You have the serum testing for genetic testing. And then they also included various costs for potential hospitalizations due to these ARIA events. And so their total cost per patient, you can see down there under anticipated annualized per patient, it's around $6,600 per patient per year, which is a very significant amount of money for a lot of people in our community. And then if you look over more to the right at the annual costs, the lower estimate they predict is $2 billion of Medicare spending will go to this, and then the upper bound around $5 million of Medicare spending. And so next, I thought specifically more about our community here up in Northern Coeur d'Alene and what it would look like to implement this into our community. I don't think this will be a thing going forward. Talking to our neurologists, they do not seem very impressed with the medication, and as of now, as far as I'm aware, are not offering it. But we talked significantly about the cost as being a huge burden, especially up here. I personally have patients coming from up to 2 hours away for their appointments, and so the transportation frequency of follow-up on them might just be insurmountable, especially those who can't drive and are dependent on others for their ADLs. But besides appointments, you throw in imaging appointments, and heaven forbid they get an ARIA, because that will increase to monthly MRIs for a while as well. Another thing is, like I talked about, the people in the study were fairly healthy, and that just doesn't match most of our populations we take care of. Many of our patients have heart disease, TIAs, or strokes, depression, substance abuse, just to name a few of the major ones that would all preclude them from getting treatment. I don't know what percentage of my patients aren't on aspirin for significant cardiovascular disease, but it is fairly small. Another barrier I see is a lot of the times I'm meeting these patients fairly late in their disease. A lot of the memory issues get attributed to just aging, or they don't like to come to the doctor until things are at a serious point where they're not managing their ADLs. And by that time, they may be way past the mild dementia that you need to have to be a lecanemab candidate at this time. And then this implementation would be an extreme burden on our healthcare facilities with all the extra infusion appointments, all the extra imaging. I know MRI wait times can be quite a while already. And so managing those would be quite a burden and taxing on our system. Then another point here, just to highlight how hard it would be to get someone going in this study or in these medication trials, even if they wanted to. This is the fairly extensive exclusion criteria in the VA list here. The VA is one of the groups that is providing this medication to its patients. And as you can see, it closely monitors most of the exclusion criteria from the trials as well. And so it would be a very large burden on our community to institute this. And so I know most of this presentation so far has been kind of doom and gloom with the recent medications, but I wanted to inject some optimism in here as well. While this drug might not be the end-all be-all for Alzheimer's treatment, it is a pretty cool step in that we're trying to develop drugs that get to the target of the disease. Whether the target of the disease should be the amyloid proteins is another question, but it represents a step in disease-modifying medications, which I think is great. And this graph I found online too, I thought was pretty interesting as well. We can see all the different medications and the different phases for future drug development. And if you notice, a lot of them end in the MAB, so I feel like a lot of these medications, and the few I looked into, are going to be targeting these beta amyloid plaques as well. But I just wanted to leave a word of caution with them because with another target here, we might get sensationalist media coverage and FDA pushing these drugs through because they represent new steps in the treatment. But always go into these new drugs with a little bit of skepticism and look at the studies yourself. But back to this picture here, there's kind of 4 areas where they're looking into drugs, including the disease-modifying biologics, which is what lecanemab falls into. And then we have the small molecule drugs as well, which I found interesting. They're looking at metformin currently, and it's in a phase 3 trial there. And then the neuropsychiatric drugs and cognitive enhancers as well are targets for future investigations. So big takeaways I had for this, and I kind of just mentioned these, but these recent advancements have created a lot of excitement and a lot of hope in people. And while they may represent a step forward, they're not the magic solutions to Alzheimer's at this time. And I think we need to be cognizant of that when we're just discussing this with patients, family members who are looking for some grain of hope in the treatment of Alzheimer's. And another big thing is we saw that lecanemab showed statistically significant improvement in cognitive decline, but it didn't. It's another question of whether this is worth the cost effectiveness, the safety issues, and if this represents a meaningful change to people. It'll be interesting to see how these trials and these measurements measure up with time going on. And so we definitely do need more long-term studies to be completed. And again, this warning, the monoclonal antibody drugs will continue to come down the pipeline. And I just urge you to assess these with scrutiny as you continue your practice. So that was what I had for my presentation. I can open it up for questions now.
Thank you, Dr. Doerr. And if people have questions, you're welcome to drop them into the chat or unmute to ask your question directly. We have Dr. Seamers saying great talk. Thanks, Dr. Doerr.
I know you talked a little bit about some of the, sorry, this is Ryan Gillis. I know you talked a little bit about some of the, how they're trying to target disease process at different points. And there's been a fair bit out there about the amyloid hypothesis and whether that we as a scientific community are really barking up the right tree at all. There have been literally hundreds of medicines studied along that pathway, and none have been very effective. Do you have any thoughts on that, or have you read more into that, just sort of the different schools of thought that exist out there and whether we really need a complete change in direction in medication development?
Yeah, so I did read a little bit into that, and you're right, especially with this study showing that they can effectively eliminate the amyloid burden, but we're still having progressive disease was concerning to me. Unfortunately, with the graph of the studies, it shows that most of the money is still in the beta amyloid hypothesis. But some of the papers I was reading who were more positive on this medication were saying that this may open the door for multimodal therapies. Optimistically thinking like eliminating the plaque can open the door for us to introduce other medications. So I don't think we need to completely eliminate research into these beta amyloid hypotheses, but I would like to see further investigation in the other hypotheses. I didn't include much of that in this talk because you could talk for a couple hours on that as well. But I was looking into other modalities, and there's been some promising studies in mice on tyrosine receptor kinase inhibitors that may help with regenerating neurons and preventing that toxicity as well. But I haven't seen anything promising in humans yet that's been limited to mice.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Others feel free to put questions in the chat. I just dropped some information about the next event in the chat, but questions in the chat or please unmute.
Have you found anywhere across the country where they're giving these infusions often?
I couldn't find data on absolute numbers, but just doing a cursory glance around programs around the country, a lot of the major medical centers like UW, Johns Hopkins, the VA are on the medication. They have extensive exclusion criteria, kind of like the VA one as well, but I couldn't find specific numbers for lecanemab. I know with aducanumab, they were well below their target for number of patients to be sustainable, and that's part of what led to their closing down production for that. I think what I saw was about they got 100 people sign up for it, and their goal was 1,000 plus. But I don't have absolute numbers for the lecanemab.
Thanks. Yeah, it looks like there's an infusion center locator on their website. That's not encountered this, trying to show you where people can go for this. So interesting.
Any other questions?
Can you hear us in the conference room?
We can.
You had mentioned the apolipo-E protein with the genetics. Have you seen any information or studies of that being the target? We learned some about it in pharmacy school, but that's kind of what I'm looking at as the most promising targets that we've seen.
Yeah, I didn't look into studies targeting that, unfortunately. I just looked into how that gene is contributing to these studies specifically. But yeah, it'd be interesting to look into.
Yeah, it would be preventing like the amyloid plaques from forming in the first place.
Right.
So
yeah.
I'm excited to see what they do with that. But some of these trials, I'm trying to figure out which ones were the lipo-E ones, but yeah.
Definitely.
Great questions. Any other questions for Dr. Doerr?
More on prevention side, what are you telling patients that are asking about this and they have a family history of Alzheimer's disease and they want to do everything they can in their power to avoid this? What's your kind of spiel on that?
Again, my spiel is kind of blunt about it. I talk about how there's a statistically significant change, but we don't exactly know how clinically meaningful that is. Like it's hard to tell a patient that, oh, the average score on a cognitive scale went down 0.4 points less with the drug over 18 months. What are most patients going to do with that? Also, it's hard to extrapolate the data for that to a personal preference, like how big of a burden would that 0.4 points be to this patient? And again, like I said earlier, a lot of my patients aren't going to be these healthy, otherwise healthy 65-year-olds with no comorbid medical indications. And so talk to them again about how we don't know how this drug is going to impact the population in general. And then I think it would be super important to go over the costs with them as well. 6,500 as an estimated yearly cost is not insignificant. And I think the biggest thing as well is 18 months is kind of as far as we go with the data right now. We don't really know past that if we're going to have continued linear slowing of cognitive decline, if it's going to taper off too. And then again, I would tell them about our neurologists' perspective on it as well, and how they don't think it's necessarily a great drug right now. But like with most conversations, it would end up being a goals of care for the patient. And so I do think there's probably a particular subset of patients who are gung-ho on everything and want to do everything they can that may follow through with this. But I'd say for the majority of my patients, I'd leave it open to them, but would try to steer them more towards holding off for now.
Yeah, sorry, my question wasn't clear. Aside from this medication entirely, what are you telling people about prevention, like exercise and diet and how much they're sleeping and staying social and all that kind of stuff?
I see. Sorry about that. Yeah, all those things you mentioned, lifestyle, staying active, engaged, both mentally and physically being important. What I see a lot with my patients is they'll self-isolate because they just can't handle the cognitive burden. They're not able to do what they could previously, and they just end up in this vicious cycle at home where they don't want to go out, so they're not socializing, they're not exercising or eating healthy, and it's just a vicious cycle. So thankfully, I've had the chance to work with Dr. Melchiori, who runs the memory clinic here, and those are the big interventions there. I think for now, sticking with the symptomatic medications that are FDA approved and much cheaper. It's probably our best bet from a medication standpoint. Again, they're treating symptoms and they're not going to reverse the disease course, but I think they're the best we have right now.
Any final questions or thoughts for Dr. Doerr? Well, Dr. Doerr, thank you so much. What a really important and interesting presentation. I know it gathered a lot of interest from our members across the state. We'll make sure that this recording becomes available on the IAFP website sometime soon. For those of you who need CME, please just note that I make sure you go into the chat and you click on that Google form to get your CME, or you email me directly. Also in the chat, for those of you still here, is the time of our next grand rounds, which is actually just following the IAFP annual conference, where we'll have tons of CME, but then we add one more on the tail end of that on the Monday, May 13th. And that's at our regular time, 11:30 Pacific time, 12:30 Mountain time. And for those of you who maybe could still make the IAFP annual conference work, but you haven't registered yet, our room block has that rate until tomorrow. I put that link in the chat too. We would love to see you in Ketchum, May 10th through 11th. Dr. Doerr, is there anything you'd like to say before we finish up?
Thank you all for coming. The one last thing I did want to mention was make sure you're looking at the caregivers too. They are struggling immensely with the patients with Alzheimer's as well. So something to not overlook with your patients.
Thank you so much again for this really important topic. Thank you everybody for being here, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.